Hey dudes, forget everything you think you know about medieval life, because tonight we're peeling back the curtains on one of the darkest truths in history, what it really meant to be a woman in the Middle Ages. No fairy tale dresses, no royal feasts, just pain, silence, survival. Girls were married off as soon as they could walk straight. Childbirth, deadly. Privacy, non-existent. And if you ever spoke out, you paid for it. Most history books skip their names, but their suffering was real. And tonight, so is their story. Before we dive in, let me ask you something real quick. Where are you watching from, and what time is it for you right now? Drop it in the comments. I love seeing this quiet little community of night owls stretch across the globe. And hey, if this video hits you or helps you sleep or just makes you feel something, leave a comment. Because no response might mean, this is the last video I ever make like this. If you're into raw, uncomfortable truths told slowly, calmly, and without sugarcoating, this is your place. Now dim the lights, pull the blanket close, and let's go somewhere the history books try to forget, to the brutal, buried lives of medieval women. Childbirth has always been a harrowing experience for women, but in the medieval period, the act of giving birth was shrouded in a constant atmosphere of danger, uncertainty, and pain. In an era without modern medical care, the risks associated with childbirth were sky high, and the process itself was often violent and traumatic. But there were few, if any, alternatives for women. The majority of births in medieval Europe took place at home, with midwives as the primary attendants. The midwife, often a woman from the local community, was sometimes trained through informal apprenticeships passed down from one generation to the next. But their training was rudimentary at best, with little knowledge of anatomy or hygiene. The chances of complications during childbirth were high, and the consequences of those complications were frequently fatal for both mother and child. At the time, childbirth was a communal affair. While the woman in labor was the center of attention, the process itself was often public. Neighbors, family members, and even children would gather around the home, watching or waiting anxiously for the outcome. The grim reality of medieval childbirth was that even if the woman survived the process, there was no guarantee of her life afterward. The risks of infection, blood loss, and postpartum complications were rampant, and many women perished within days or weeks of delivering their babies. The medical knowledge of the time was rudimentary. The use of herbal remedies, charms, and prayers was common, but these were often ineffective against the very real dangers women faced. The medieval understanding of infection was non-existent, and the concept of antiseptic or sterilization hadn't even been conceived. Thus, any tool, any hand that came in contact with the mother could introduce deadly bacteria, leading to the rapid spread of infections that were often the ultimate cause of death. But there was one element of childbirth that women dreaded most: the prolonged labor. Without painkillers or anesthesia, the suffering of childbirth was as much psychological as it was physical. Women were expected to endure labor for hours, sometimes days, with only the help of family members or their midwives. There was little respite, and often no sympathy. In some areas, women who struggled to give birth were accused of not being strong enough, of being weak, or even cursed. Still, women carried on with the task of reproducing, often for the sake of family lineage, survival, or duty to their husbands. The high rates of infant mortality, which could reach as high as 30% or more, made every birth a gamble. In a sense, every woman was part of a survival game. Survival for her child, her family, and herself. But even within these dire circumstances, there were certain strategies, passed down through generations, which helped increase the odds of survival. Women knew to keep warm during labor, to drink specific herbal teas, and to lie in particular positions that might encourage the baby's passage through the birth canal. These were not medical techniques by modern standards, but they were practices that had been tested over centuries of painful experience. For some, they worked. As you read this, it's hard to imagine the overwhelming anxiety and fear that must have been felt during childbirth. With little support beyond the midwife, no modern tools, and minimal understanding of the process, medieval women walked a thin line between life and death every time they gave birth. But what happened when women did survive this ordeal? Did they celebrate the birth of their child? Or was it merely the beginning of another struggle? For those fortunate enough to survive the actual birthing process, the danger was far from over. The aftermath of childbirth in medieval Europe was fraught with complications that could claim a woman's life just as easily as labor itself. These were women who had crossed the final hurdle, but they still had to navigate a labyrinth of dangers that few survived without significant hardship. The first threat that many women faced after childbirth was hemorrhaging. Without modern knowledge of blood loss, physicians could do little to stop the steady flow of blood that often followed the birth. In medieval times, women commonly gave birth on their backs or knees, but the position was not always conducive to stopping hemorrhage. Any amount of blood loss could quickly become fatal if not controlled, and there was often no medical way of responding to this emergency. As days passed, the risk of infection grew exponentially. Medieval medicine, at best, treated infection with herbs and tinctures, some of which were effective, but many more were not. It wasn't uncommon for a woman to develop a severe infection after giving birth, especially if the placenta wasn't fully expelled. This condition, known as puerperal fever, was a killer. Even though its causes were unknown at the time, it was widely recognized that the disease spread quickly and often took the life of the mother within days. No amount of prayer or herbal remedy could save her if the infection took hold. What's often overlooked in these discussions is the overwhelming fatigue that women suffered after childbirth. It wasn't just the exhaustion from labor, but the toll that months of pregnancy and the extreme physical demands of childbirth placed on their bodies. The medieval diet, often lacking in essential vitamins and nutrients, further drained a woman's strength, leaving her weak and vulnerable to sickness. Nursing was another trial in itself. For many women, breastfeeding was the only option to nourish their babies. And in an era of limited knowledge about infant care, the health of the newborn was directly linked to the mother's own health. A woman whose body had been weakened by childbirth would struggle even more to provide adequate nutrition. Malnourished mothers in particular often had difficulty producing enough milk, which meant that their babies might not survive. And even when the baby did survive, it faced its own dangers. Many infants did not make it past infancy, and even fewer reached the age of 5. Then, there was the social stigma surrounding women who failed to bear children or who suffered in childbirth. The medieval world placed immense pressure on women to reproduce, especially in the context of marriage. A woman who could not give her husband a child was often seen as a failure, a burden to her family. In extreme cases, this failure led to neglect or even abandonment. In some regions, barren women were branded as witches or cursed, accused of being in league with demonic forces that kept them from procreating. But these were also women who, through no fault of their own, had suffered grievous losses at the hands of childbirth. In the higher social classes, women's survival after childbirth was, in many ways, more of a status symbol than a sign of personal success. Women of nobility, while often receiving better care and support during labor, still faced the same risks. They had access to physicians, midwives, and even royal doctors, but these medical professionals could do little when it came to the dangers of childbirth. Even though royal births were treated with pomp and ceremony, these women too could die in childbed, leaving behind the same sorrowful legacy as their peasant counterparts. There were, however, some measures that helped improve a woman's odds of survival. In wealthier households, midwives often had more experience, and women were sometimes given more time and support to rest after childbirth. In some cases, noble women had access to more advanced treatments, like bloodletting and early forms of surgery, though these were still far from effective. Additionally, there was a growing awareness among some physicians that cleanliness during childbirth could reduce the risks of infection. But these practices were far from widespread, and even among the best trained midwives, there was only so much they could do. But while survival after childbirth was a feat in itself, the real question remained: what was the quality of life for these women after they had endured such a traumatic process? Were they able to fully recover from childbirth, or were they forever scarred, physically and emotionally? Even after surviving childbirth, the women of medieval Europe faced a lifetime of struggle. The physical toll that childbirth took on their bodies was often permanent. Many women carried the scars of labor with them for the rest of their lives. A woman's body, after multiple births, could become weakened and irreparably damaged. Chronic pain, prolapsed organs, and weakened pelvic muscles were common among women who had borne many children. These health issues often went untreated simply because there was no understanding of how to address them. One of the most troubling outcomes of childbirth was the physical weakening of the body, particularly for women who had multiple pregnancies. The act of carrying and birthing a child put immense strain on the body. Without the benefit of modern care, women's bodies often did not heal properly after childbirth. The womb, stretched and strained during labor, could fail to return to its original shape, leading to complications like prolapse, where the uterus descends from its proper position, causing pain and difficulty in performing daily tasks. These women would suffer silently, as there was no real medical intervention available to help them. The emotional toll was just as severe. Women who survived childbirth were often left with a sense of loss and despair, particularly in the case of infant deaths. Infant mortality rates were extraordinarily high during this period, with many babies not surviving their first year. A woman who had lost several children over her lifetime might be left with feelings of guilt, loneliness, and helplessness. Those who survived often felt physically, mentally, and emotionally drained, with no real avenue to seek support or comfort. Moreover, the societal expectations placed upon women further compounded their suffering. Once a woman had borne children, her role within the community was set in stone. She was expected to continue the cycle of reproduction, often without regard for her health or well-being. The relentless pressure to marry, reproduce, and raise children left little room for personal agency. There were very few opportunities for a woman to control her own fate. And most women, regardless of their social class, were expected to fulfill the role of mother, wife, and homemaker without complaint. For women of the lower classes, the hardships didn't end after childbirth. Their lives were marked by poverty, constant labor, and a complete lack of access to quality healthcare. Many women worked in fields, tending to crops, carrying heavy loads, and caring for animals. After childbirth, they were expected to return to these duties, regardless of their physical state. There was no time for rest or recuperation, and many women worked until they collapsed from exhaustion. A woman's body was often treated as a tool for labor, with little regard for the damage it sustained during the rigors of childbearing. Even in wealthier families, the recovery process was far from ideal. While noble women might have had access to better nutrition and rest, they were still expected to fulfill their roles as wives and mothers with little help. The psychological burden of childbirth, particularly for those who had suffered complications, was rarely addressed. Noble women who survived the trauma of childbirth might be expected to carry on with their responsibilities in the household, managing estates and overseeing servants, all while dealing with the emotional aftermath of their experiences. But beyond the physical and emotional toll, there was another, perhaps more insidious challenge that medieval women faced: the toll of constant childbearing. Women in the medieval period were expected to bear child after child, often until they could no longer do so. This meant that by the time they were in their 30s, they had already given birth to half a dozen or more children. Many women died in their 30s or 40s, victims of the wear and tear on their bodies, their health forever compromised by the repeated strains of childbirth. Still, women continued to bear children, whether out of necessity, duty, or desire. The medieval world, with all its hardships, was a world defined by resilience. In the face of suffering and uncertainty, women carried on, navigating a life full of pain and loss with incredible strength. Their struggles, though often hidden from history's view, formed the backbone of medieval society. When you reflect on the lives of these women, it raises the question: how much of their suffering and endurance went unnoticed, even by the societies that demanded so much from them? What would have happened if there had been more support, more compassion, and more understanding of their struggles? As we look back on the medieval period, we realize that these women's experiences were not isolated, but were shared by countless others throughout history. Their resilience in the face of unimaginable odds paved the way for future generations of women to fight for better care, better lives, and a better world. The question remains: how far have we really come in understanding and supporting the women who continue to bear the weight of life's greatest challenges? In medieval Europe, women's legal rights were a far cry from the freedoms enjoyed by men, and their role within society was largely shaped by law, custom, and religious doctrine. The medieval period was a time when a woman's identity and worth were defined by her relationship to men, first to her father, then to her husband, and later, if widowed, to her son or another male relative. Though women were essential to the functioning of medieval society, their rights were severely restricted, often relegated to a life of subjugation and dependency. At the heart of the medieval legal system was the doctrine of coverture. This legal principle dictated that a married woman's identity and property were subsumed under her husband's. Upon marriage, a woman's legal standing was erased. She ceased to exist as a separate legal entity and was considered part of her husband's household. This meant that she could not own property, enter into contracts, or even make legal decisions without her husband's consent. In many ways, she was considered the legal property of her husband. This system was not just a product of local customs, but was also reinforced by the Church, which held significant sway over medieval law. Church doctrine stated that a woman's role was to be a dutiful wife and mother, supporting her husband's authority. Her legal rights were essentially non-existent in the eyes of the law, and even if she were a woman of high social standing, her legal autonomy was severely limited. Inheritance laws, too, heavily favored men. In the case of a woman's death, her property was often transferred to her male relatives, be it her father, brother, or husband, regardless of her wishes. Women had limited inheritance rights, and even if a woman inherited land or wealth, her husband or male relative typically controlled it. A widow's legal standing was dependent on her relationship to a man, and she was frequently left vulnerable to exploitation or poverty. A woman's ability to own property was not entirely absent, but it was complicated and often required significant male intervention. For example, some women could inherit property through their father's will, but in many cases, this property was controlled by male guardians or husbands. If a woman were to inherit land, she might be able to manage it, but it was usually under the supervision of a male relative or an appointed male guardian. In the rare cases where women held land outright, it was typically in the form of dower property, a portion of her husband's estate that was set aside for her support should he die. Even then, the land was hers only to the extent that she remained unmarried. Should she remarry, the dower was often returned to the family of her deceased husband. The Church also had a profound influence on the legal status of women, particularly through its teachings on marriage. The Church's view on marriage was that it was a sacrament, sacred and unbreakable. This religious perspective placed women in a subordinate role, reinforcing the notion that their duty was to support their husbands in all matters. The notion of marital unity held by the Church meant that a woman was expected to give up her legal rights upon marriage, further reinforcing her lack of agency in matters of property and inheritance. One significant example of the legal limitations women faced can be seen in the practice of widowhood. While it may seem that widows had some independence in managing their own affairs, this was often far from the case. Widows were often coerced into remarriage by their families or social expectations, and in many cases, their dower property was taken from them by their in-laws. Even those who did manage to retain their wealth or property found it difficult to control or manage without the assistance of male guardians. In some cases, widows were left destitute, particularly if they had no male heirs to care for them. In addition to these legal constraints, the medieval period was also marked by a lack of any formal legal protections for women. There were no laws against domestic violence, and the concept of marital rape was unheard of. Women who were abused or mistreated by their husbands had little recourse within the legal system. In fact, it was often assumed that a woman's place in marriage was to submit to her husband's authority, which extended to any form of physical or emotional abuse he might inflict. Women who dared to speak out about mistreatment were often seen as disrespectful or unruly, and their complaints were ignored or dismissed. The notion of dowries, another legal institution that governed many medieval marriages, further reflected the inequities women faced. The dowry was essentially a financial transaction that ensured a woman's marriage, and it was typically paid by her family. This dowry was meant to support the woman and her husband in their marriage, but in practice, It often reinforced a woman's dependence on her husband or his family. A woman's social status, security, and even her ability to marry were often determined by the size of the dowry, and the pressure to secure an advantageous marriage could leave women feeling trapped in a cycle of financial dependence. At the same time, there were women who pushed back against these limitations, though their resistance was rare and often at great personal cost. Some women managed to wield their influence behind the scenes, using their status as noblewomen or widows to control property, arrange marriages, or influence the political landscape. But these women were exceptions, and their actions were frequently dismissed as anomalies rather than examples of broader societal shifts. Still, these exceptions remind us of one critical fact. Even within the harsh patriarchal framework of medieval society, women found ways to assert their autonomy, however limited it might have been. But how did these women fare in a world where the law itself silenced their voices and where men controlled every aspect of their existence? Despite the immense legal and societal constraints placed upon women in medieval Europe, history is filled with stories of women who, though often constrained by their circumstances, found ways to challenge the system. These acts of resistance, while subtle and sometimes imperceptible in the larger historical narrative, were crucial in asserting women's agency in a world dominated by male authority. One of the most significant forms of resistance was the ability of women to exercise influence through their roles within the household. Though legally bound by the principle of coverture and bound to their husbands, many women found ways to indirectly control property and make decisions that would have otherwise been restricted. These women operated within the system, yet found ways to wield considerable power. A widow, for instance, had the potential to manage her husband's estate. While many widows were forced into remarriage, some used their position to secure land or wealth, ensuring their children's future and sometimes even that of their community. Perhaps the most striking examples of resistance came from noblewomen, who, despite their restricted legal rights, exercised their influence in matters of inheritance and property. In medieval Europe, noble families controlled vast estates, and women, even within the constraints of coverture, were key figures in these holdings. If a nobleman died without a male heir, the inheritance often passed to his daughters. While they could not legally control the estates outright, noblewomen managed them with the assistance of trusted stewards and advisors. In some cases, these women held onto property by acting as de facto heads of their households, whether through legal loopholes or sheer force of will. Women also found ways to resist through acts of defiance within marriage. While medieval law dictated that a woman's legal rights were entirely subordinated to her husband's, there were numerous instances of women asserting their will in matters of marriage and family life. For example, the process of annulment, where a marriage was declared invalid, was a method that some women used to escape particularly oppressive unions. While it was generally the church that granted annulments, the power dynamics of medieval marriage meant that women could find ways to petition for annulment, especially if they were subjected to abuse or neglect. In some cases, women were able to assert their legal rights through their involvement in the church. While medieval women were not permitted to serve as priests, they found other ways to exercise influence within religious institutions. The most common route was through the convents and abbeys, which acted as both religious centers and powerful political entities. Nuns, though bound by strict religious vows, could wield considerable power within these institutions. and some abbesses controlled vast estates and had significant political influence. For instance, Hildegard of Bingen, a 12th century abbess, was not only a religious leader, but also a scholar, writer, and political advisor. Her influence extended beyond the convent walls and into the corridors of power. In some cases, women took more dramatic steps to resist their limited legal rights. While it was rare, there were instances where women used their position as a widow to challenge the patriarchal system and assert their autonomy. The process of dower, the portion of property a woman was entitled to upon her husband's death, was supposed to secure a widow's livelihood, but many widows found themselves exploited by their deceased husband's family. In response, some widows took legal action to protect their dower, petitioning the courts and demanding their rights. These cases were difficult, and victory was rare, but they are examples of women who did not passively accept their subjugation. Legal challenges were often accompanied by social resistance. Women's roles in medieval society were frequently defined by their relationships to men, but there were moments when women asserted their influence over public and private life. One of the most notable ways this was achieved was through women's involvement in trade. Though women were often relegated to domestic labor, many worked within the marketplace, managing shops, dealing with goods, and even engaging in trade. While laws often restricted their participation in certain businesses, women of all social classes found ways to enter the commercial world, running their own businesses or working alongside men. In some cases, they even accumulated wealth and assets, further solidifying their place in society. Women also resisted through subtle subversions of legal and religious norms. One such example is the female saint tradition, in which women's roles were elevated through religious veneration. In a society where women's legal roles were diminished, many were able to attain a position of spiritual authority by being canonized as saints or by establishing their own monastic communities. These women may not have had political power in the traditional sense, but their spiritual authority gave them a unique form of resistance against societal constraints. The most powerful, though often unspoken act of resistance was women's ability to control their bodies. In a society where a woman's body was often viewed as a vessel for reproduction, many women found ways to subvert their reproductive duties. While methods of birth control were rudimentary and often dangerous, women employed various methods, from herbal remedies to more obscure practices, in an attempt to control when and how they would bear children. This form of control, though hidden, was one of the few ways in which women were able to assert some power over their own lives. In the face of such a restrictive and patriarchal society, these acts of resistance were incredibly significant. They were small, subtle, and often fraught with risk, but they marked the first steps towards changing the landscape of women's rights. Even in the absence of a formal legal system that protected them, medieval women managed to navigate the strictures of their society, using ingenuity, defiance, and sometimes sheer perseverance to carve out spaces for themselves. Despite these acts of resistance, the question remains: how much of this defiance went unrecorded, swept under the rug of history, leaving us with an incomplete understanding of the lives and struggles of these women? Though medieval women often found subtle ways to resist the oppressive legal and societal structures surrounding them, their struggles laid the groundwork for long-term changes that would not come to fruition until centuries later. These small acts of resistance, while unnoticed by many, were part of a broader, slowly evolving movement that would eventually push the boundaries of what was considered acceptable for women in the Western world. The legal battles fought by medieval women often centered around the issue of property rights, or more specifically, the lack thereof. While some noble women were able to manage land or influence estate affairs, they did so under the constant threat of male oversight. The lingering effects of coverture, where women lost their independent legal identity upon marriage, would not be fully addressed until the late 19th century. It wasn't until the rise of the women's suffrage movement and the gradual realization that women's rights were tied to their ability to control their own property that these issues began to be tackled in earnest. However, the women who fought these battles in the medieval period, those who successfully retained control over their dowries, who managed estates after their husbands died, or who managed to escape the grasp of controlling male relatives, set a precedent for the future. They proved that women were capable of holding power over property, and in doing so, they challenged centuries of patriarchal norms. But for the majority of women, these struggles were more about survival than empowerment. The legacy of these women's quiet resistance lies not just in the victories won, but in the very act of resistance itself. Even the church, which had long been an agent of patriarchal control, eventually began to recognize the contributions of women. While the church's view on marriage and women's roles was still restrictive, women like Hildegard of Bingen and Catherine of Siena helped pave the way for women's involvement in intellectual and theological matters. They managed to rise above the societal limitations placed on them by virtue of their deep spiritual authority. Their contributions, though often overlooked, laid the groundwork for future generations of women to assert their intellectual autonomy. In the centuries following the medieval period, many of the legal restrictions that women had endured would be challenged and, eventually, dismantled. While the medieval period itself saw little substantial change in terms of legal rights for women, the groundwork for reform was established through the collective struggles and resistance of those women who sought to assert their autonomy in a world that continuously sought to silence them. Women's access to property, marriage rights, and legal standing would evolve during the early modern period and into the 19th and 20th centuries. The feminist movements that arose in the 19th century, seeking the right to vote, the right to own property, and the right to education, owe much to the long history of medieval women's struggles. The quiet acts of resistance in the medieval period, whether through property management, inheritance disputes, or religious influence, would eventually inspire broader political changes. These early efforts were foundational in shaping the future legal landscape for women in the Western world. However, even as laws began to change in the 19th and 20th centuries, the legacy of medieval women's legal struggles can still be seen today. Women continue to fight for equal rights under the law, particularly in areas like property ownership, family law, and reproductive rights. In many ways, these struggles are the continuation of the centuries-long fight for autonomy that began with the women of medieval Europe. While the changes that came during the Enlightenment and the Industrial Revolution were pivotal, they did not come easily. Women fought tooth and nail for their rights, often facing resistance from both the church and state. But in the long run, their persistence paid off. Today, women in many parts of the world can exercise rights that medieval women could only dream of: owning property, participating in politics, seeking divorce, and deciding their own futures. These gains, though hard-won, stand as a testament to the resilience and determination of those early pioneers of women's rights. Yet when we look at the long history of women's legal struggles, we must ask, how many women's voices were lost along the way, and how many of their small acts of resistance went unnoticed, buried in the annals of history? The journey towards legal equality for women is far from complete. And as we reflect on the struggles of medieval women, we are reminded that history is not just about the victories, but also about the quiet, everyday acts of resilience that paved the way for those victories. What can we learn from the resilience of medieval women, and how does their story continue to shape the fight for women's rights today? In the feudal system of medieval Europe, women's lives were shaped by a rigid structure that dictated their roles within society. Primarily as wives, mothers, and workers, the feudal hierarchy was based on land ownership, and power was concentrated in the hands of a few men who controlled vast estates. For the majority of women, however, their lives were defined by their relationship to these landowners. First, as daughters, then as wives, and sometimes as widows. At the lowest level of the feudal system were peasants, also called serfs, who worked the land for their lords in exchange for protection. These men and women were tied to the land and had little control over their lives. They could not leave the land without their lord's permission, and they were subject to the lord's authority in almost every aspect of their lives. Women who were born into peasantry had few choices beyond working the land, raising children, and submitting to the will of their fathers or husbands. Marriage, often arranged when they were very young, marked the beginning of their servitude to another man, and women in these marriages had few legal rights. They had to bear children, often in harsh conditions, and perform the domestic duties required of them, all while laboring in the fields alongside their husbands. In feudal Europe, women did not inherit land unless there were no male heirs. Women of higher social status, particularly those of noble birth, had more power in this regard. They could inherit land, but only under specific conditions. For example, if a nobleman died without a male heir, his daughter could inherit the estate. However, her rights to the land were typically controlled by her husband once she married. Even in these higher social classes, women's legal autonomy was minimal. While noblewomen could exert some influence within their households, their power was ultimately subject to the decisions of the male members of their families. Even in noble households, where women had more authority over managing property and finances, their freedom was often severely limited. Marriages were frequently arranged to secure alliances and maintain political power. The concept of marital coverture applied even in these elevated circles, meaning that once married, a woman was expected to serve her husband, manage his household, and bear children, often at the expense of her personal autonomy. Women in these positions had the advantage of education and access to wealth, but their legal rights remained limited by the same patriarchal structures that bound peasant women to their lords. As women moved up the social ladder, their roles changed in certain ways, but the overall limitations remained the same. For noblewomen, the marriage contract was a political tool. These marriages were typically more about securing land, power, and influence than about love or companionship. A noblewoman's status was tied to her husband's wealth and land holdings, and she had to navigate the expectations placed upon her as both a wife and a mother. A noblewoman's duties might include managing estates in her husband's absence, running the household, overseeing servants, and making strategic alliances through marriage. These roles could provide women with some authority in their domestic spheres, but their ultimate power was still constrained by the patriarchal nature of feudal society. For women of the lower classes, survival was the primary concern. In addition to the daily demands of childbearing and domestic labor, many peasant women also worked the land, often performing tasks that were physically demanding. They helped with planting, harvesting, and caring for livestock, working alongside their husbands. The work was grueling, and the conditions were harsh, but it was necessary for their survival. The feudal system relied heavily on the labor of peasants, and women played a vital role in sustaining the agricultural economy that supported the entire structure of society. Despite their hard work, however, these women were often treated as little more than property themselves. In rural areas, a woman's life was typically spent in the home and on the land. The home was a place where women carried out their duties as wives and mothers, ensuring that their households were maintained and their children cared for. Women were responsible for the day-to-day running of the household, including cooking, cleaning, spinning wool, and making clothes. In addition to these domestic tasks, they were expected to care for the children and manage any animals the family owned. Their work was essential for the survival of the family unit, yet it went largely unacknowledged. But there were moments in history when women of lower status stepped outside their assigned roles. Some women fought in battles, especially when their homes or lands were threatened. In some cases, women who were left in charge of estates during the absence of their husbands or fathers exercised remarkable power in their own right. Some women, particularly widows, even managed to acquire wealth, control property, and challenge the existing order. While these instances were rare and often overlooked, they stand as examples of how women occasionally subverted their prescribed roles and navigated a world that sought to define them as subordinate. Despite these occasional acts of resistance, the majority of women in medieval feudal society lived lives of servitude, with little opportunity for upward mobility or independence. The legal system favored men at every turn, and the social structure reinforced the idea that women were not to be seen as equals. Marriage was the only option for many women, and their lives were defined by their roles as wives and mothers, as dictated by their husbands and the church. But as we look back at the roles these women played in the feudal system, we can't help but wonder, how did these women manage to survive the oppressive conditions that defined their lives? Was it through sheer resilience, or did they find ways to subvert the rules that sought to bind them? While life for women in feudal Europe was harsh, oppressive, and limited in many ways, it would be a mistake to overlook the extraordinary resilience and resourcefulness that these women displayed in their everyday lives, faced with overwhelming challenges. Women learned to adapt and find ways to not only survive, but sometimes even thrive within a system that was structured to diminish their power and independence. The harshest aspect of the feudal system was its dependence on agricultural labor. Peasant women, who worked alongside their husbands in the fields, were the backbone of the agrarian economy. While much of their work was unacknowledged, it was essential to the survival of the family and the community. These women not only raised children, but also planted crops, tended livestock, and performed a variety of tasks that contributed directly to the food supply. In addition to their work in the fields, women often had to handle the household's finances. While they were not the primary decision makers, many peasant women had a role in managing the day-to-day expenses of running a household. They often bartered goods, took care of the family's budget, and made crucial decisions about what to grow, buy, or sell. Women understood the necessity of resourcefulness and were skilled in ensuring that the household survived even in lean times. These were women who understood the value of every coin, every piece of clothing, and every scrap of food, carefully conserving and recycling materials whenever possible. The work of peasant women extended beyond just survival. They were often the chief preservers of knowledge and culture in their communities. Women, particularly older women, passed down recipes, medicinal remedies, and folklore. In a society where literacy rates were low, women were often the oral historians of their villages. They were the ones who taught the younger generation how to cook, sew, tend to the sick, and carry on traditions that were essential to the continuity of their community. Even in the most difficult times, women's resourcefulness ensured that knowledge and culture were not lost. The practice of herbal medicine, for instance, was largely in the hands of women. While men may have been the doctors or healers in larger towns or cities, it was women who provided the basic care for their families in rural areas. They knew how to treat wounds, ease childbirth, and cure common ailments with herbs that grew naturally in their environment. Many women were skilled midwives who helped deliver babies, and their knowledge of pregnancy and childbirth was passed down from one generation to the next. Though these women did not have formal training or recognition in the medical profession, they were often the first line of defense against illness and injury. Women's roles as caregivers and healers were vital to the survival of their families. In addition to child rearing, women also took on the responsibility of caring for the sick and elderly. It was often up to women to keep the family healthy and to nurse their husbands, children, and elderly parents back to health when they fell ill. This was a demanding role, especially considering the absence of proper medical care and the dangers that came with childbirth and illness. But perhaps the most striking aspect of feudal women's resilience was their ability to navigate and sometimes subvert the structures of power that kept them subjugated. While women were not allowed to own land or property in most cases, some were able to find ways to exercise authority over it. Widows, for example, could sometimes inherit their husband's land, and in the absence of a male heir, they could be the head of their household. While their legal rights were still limited, widows often found ways to maintain control of the property, making key decisions about land use, family finances, and alliances. This ability to manage property was often central to women's survival, especially in the case of noble women. Though noble women were typically expected to marry for political and strategic reasons, there were some who managed estates and wielded considerable power in their own right. If their husbands were absent, they might run their husbands' estates and manage business affairs, sometimes overseeing hundreds of servants and tenants. Some noble women became significant figures in the feudal economy, engaging in trade, lending money, and managing large agricultural operations. While their authority was always subject to their husband's or father's control, these women could make critical decisions that affected the lives of many people. Women in feudal Europe also found ways to resist the overwhelming societal pressures, to conform to their prescribed roles. One of the most powerful forms of resistance was their ability to maintain control over their fertility. While it was socially expected for women to have children in order to secure family lines and perpetuate the feudal system, many women found ways to delay or limit the number of children they had. This could be done through the use of herbs, rituals, and even abstinence, though it was rare and often practiced in secrecy. This ability to control their reproductive lives, even within such an oppressive system, was a subtle but significant form of resistance. Women also found ways to exert influence within the religious framework of feudal Europe. While the church had a patriarchal structure, women in religious orders such as nuns found relative freedom. Some women joined convents to escape the stifling confines of marriage, where they could gain education, access to property, and spiritual authority. While nuns were often subject to the rules of the monastery, many became influential figures within their religious communities, helping to manage estates, fundraise for the church, and provide services for the local population. The influence of religious women extended beyond the convent walls, and in some cases, nuns had political power, influencing the decisions of kings and lords. Despite their subjugation, the resilience of these women in the face of overwhelming odds provides an important lesson in survival. Through their resourcefulness, women in the feudal system carved out spaces of influence within the limited roles that society allowed them. They managed to provide for their families, protect their children, and sometimes gain a degree of authority, even if it was limited. Their ability to adapt to their circumstances, to make the most of what little power they had, and to resist when necessary, helped ensure that they survived in a world that was often unforgiving. The question remains, how many of these acts of resistance, no matter how small or subtle, shaped the world we live in today? How much of our modern society can be traced back to the quiet strength and ingenuity of these medieval women? As we look back on the lives of women in medieval feudal Europe, their struggles and triumphs, though often overshadowed by the dominant narratives of men, have had a lasting impact on history. The legacy of these women lies not only in the direct changes they made to their own lives, but also in the way they subtly laid the groundwork for the broader shifts in social, economic, and legal structures that would unfold over the centuries. While women in feudal Europe had limited control over their own destinies, their resilience and determination left an imprint that would influence future generations. One of the most significant legacies of medieval women was their role in shaping the agricultural and economic systems. Women were vital to the survival of families, especially in the peasant class, where they worked the land, maintained households, and ensured the well-being of their children. These women's labor, though often invisible, was the foundation of the medieval economy. By holding families together, managing resources, and raising the next generation, they played an indispensable role in sustaining the feudal system. Moreover, the daily struggles of feudal women led to the development of a system of community support. In villages, women often formed strong networks with one another, exchanging goods, services, and assistance during times of need. These informal networks, built on mutual support and solidarity, helped women endure the harsh realities of life in a feudal society. Such community bonds were essential not only for survival, but for the preservation of knowledge, culture, and traditions. The fact that some women managed to rise above the constraints of the feudal system, whether through inheritance, land management, or religious authority, reveals the inherent potential for change within the system. These women demonstrated that, even within a rigid social structure, it was possible to wield power and influence. While these cases were rare and often limited to women of higher status, they set important precedents for women's rights and autonomy in later centuries. One of the most significant elements of feudal women's legacy is the role that noble women played in the inheritance and management of estates. Although the laws and customs of the time typically favored male heirs, noble women were sometimes able to inherit property, especially when there were no male heirs. This ability, though limited, provided women with opportunities to influence, politics and economics at a local level. Some women who inherited land managed these estates effectively, overseeing the work of tenants, managing resources, and ensuring the well-being of those who lived on the land. They were often the ones who made key decisions about agricultural production, trade, and the distribution of wealth. In religious contexts, the influence of women was also notable. Though the church was a male-dominated institution, many women found a voice through religious orders. Nuns and abbesses held considerable authority within their monasteries and convents, managing lands, overseeing the education of girls, and sometimes even acting as mediators in disputes. While religious life may have been restrictive in many ways, it also provided women with opportunities to lead, govern, and exercise influence that they could not otherwise access. Women like Hildegard of Bingen and Catherine of Siena became influential spiritual leaders who contributed to theological thought, written works, and even political matters. However, despite these rare instances of influence, the majority of women in feudal Europe lived lives marked by hardship and limited legal rights. But it is crucial to recognize that even in these difficult circumstances, women continued to resist, adapt, and survive. Their roles as workers, caregivers, and community members laid the foundation for future movements toward women's rights and gender equality. The idea of women as active agents within society, whether in managing households or participating in religious or political affairs, continued to develop over the centuries, culminating in the eventual push for women's suffrage, property rights, and access to education. The legacy of feudal women also extends to the ways in which women today continue to challenge and reshape their roles in society. In many ways, the struggles of medieval women paved the way for the feminist movements of the 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries. The fight for women's rights, including the right to own property, access education, and participate in politics, owes much to the persistence and resilience of these early women. Their everyday survival against the odds laid the foundation for the political and social changes that would follow in later centuries. As we reflect on their legacy, it's important to ask, how can we draw inspiration from the resourcefulness and determination of these medieval women in our own lives today? What can we learn from their ability to adapt and survive in the face of overwhelming odds? And how can we apply these lessons to the ongoing struggle for gender equality and women's rights around the world? In conclusion, the lives of women in feudal Europe may seem distant and often difficult to relate to, but their legacy is very much alive today. Their perseverance, resourcefulness, and ability to navigate a world of limited rights and harsh realities have left an indelible mark on history. By examining their struggles, we gain a deeper understanding of the foundations of women's rights movements and the ongoing fight for equality. In the mid-14th century, Europe was struck by a calamity so severe that it would forever alter the course of history. The Black Death, one of the deadliest pandemics the world has ever known, swept across the continent with terrifying speed. It is estimated that between 25% and 60% of Europe's population was wiped out by the disease, which came in the form of bubonic, septicemic, and pneumonic plague. Entire villages were decimated, and the social, economic, and cultural structures of medieval society were irreparably changed. For women, the Black Death represented not just a physical danger, but also an emotional and social upheaval. In many ways, the pandemic exacerbated the already difficult lives of women in medieval Europe. amplifying the existing vulnerabilities that they faced in a society dominated by men. For those in the lower classes, the Black Death led to even more severe hardships, as their roles as caregivers, workers, and mothers became even more difficult to navigate. But even women in higher social classes were not exempt from the terror and loss brought on by the plague. The early symptoms of the plague were unmistakable: fever, chills, swollen lymph nodes, and severe pain. It spread rapidly, often killing its victims within a matter of days. In the crowded cities and towns, the disease spread like wildfire, claiming the lives of men, women, and children alike. The urban poor, who lived in squalid conditions and had little access to healthcare, were particularly vulnerable, but the disease showed no mercy, taking lives across all social strata. For medieval women, who were often responsible for managing households, caring for children, and maintaining domestic life, the Black Death posed a particular challenge. Many women found themselves alone, either because their husbands had succumbed to the disease or because they had been forced to care for sick family members while also tending to their own needs. In some cases, the loss of one family member led to the collapse of an entire household, as the woman left behind had no one to support her. This was particularly true for widows or unmarried women, who faced a grim future without the protection of a male relative. At the same time, women played a crucial role in caring for the sick. In a world with no modern medicine or knowledge of infectious disease, the caregivers were often the family members themselves. Women were the primary caregivers for the ill, and their role in tending to the sick during the plague was vital to the survival of their communities. It was not uncommon for women to tend to their husbands, children, or elderly relatives, often at the cost of their own health. Unfortunately, many women who were exposed to the plague as they cared for others became infected themselves. The laborious demands of caregiving were compounded by the mental and emotional toll of witnessing so much death. The Black Death did not discriminate, and even the wealthy were not immune. For women of noble or royal birth, the loss of family members could be devastating. Many women, who had already been responsible for managing their households day-to-day operations, now found themselves dealing with the psychological trauma of losing loved ones and the responsibility of running estates alone. But for the majority of women, particularly those in lower classes, the loss was more than just emotional. It was often economic. The death of a spouse or child could leave a woman destitute with no means of support. The death of a male family member often meant the loss of not just a provider, but also a protector, leaving women vulnerable to exploitation and abuse. In many cases, the inheritance rights of women were diminished by the laws of the time, which favored male heirs. This left women with little recourse when their husbands or fathers died, further compounding the economic instability that the Black Death caused. Even with all of these challenges, women's resilience shone through. Many women found ways to adapt, even as their world crumbled around them. Those who survived took on even more responsibility, managing their families, businesses, and lands. Some women, especially widows, became the de facto heads of households and gained more independence as a result. Others, who had previously been in a subjugated position, found themselves with newfound freedom as the traditional gender roles began to shift due to the social upheaval caused by the plague. Women also began to play a more prominent role in the religious sphere during this time. The church, which had already played a significant role in the lives of women, became even more integral during the Black Death. In the absence of medical care, many people turned to religion for comfort and guidance. Women found themselves participating in religious rituals, attending services, and even taking leadership roles in religious communities. The fear of death and the uncertainty of the future led many women to seek solace in faith, and some women took up the mantle of healer or spiritual leader, comforting those who had lost loved ones and providing a sense of purpose in the midst of chaos. Despite their efforts, however, the social and economic impact of the plague on women was undeniable. The massive loss of life altered not just the social fabric of medieval Europe, but the position of women within that structure. The Black Death forced society to confront the value of women's labor, both domestic and outside the home, and many women began to assert their independence in ways that had not been possible before. But as we consider the immense suffering and loss that the Black Death caused, one must ask, how did these women find the strength to carry on in such dark times? What enabled them to survive not just physically, but emotionally, spiritually, and socially as well? As the initial waves of the Black Death receded, the landscape of Europe had been forever altered. The survivors, including women, were left to rebuild a society that had been devastated not just by the death toll, but by the profound economic and social shifts that followed. With millions dead, the labor force had been decimated, and entire regions faced a shortage of workers. This upheaval brought about changes in the roles women played in their communities, often pushing them into positions of greater responsibility and independence than they had ever known before. For women, particularly those in lower classes, the aftermath of the plague presented both opportunities and challenges. With the deaths of so many men, many women found themselves without husbands, sons, or brothers. The traditional family structure had been disrupted, and women who had previously been confined to domestic duties were suddenly required to take on new roles. Widows, in particular, gained new responsibilities. Many were forced to manage estates, run farms, and maintain businesses that had once been overseen by their male relatives. In some cases, widows proved to be competent managers, ensuring the survival of their family's wealth and property. This shift in roles, though forced by necessity, created a unique opportunity for women to step into positions of greater power, however briefly. But with these new responsibilities came significant difficulties. Widows were often left with the emotional burden of grief and the financial burden of supporting their families alone. Inheritance laws, which often favored male heirs, could leave women vulnerable, and they struggled to navigate the complex legal and social systems that had been designed to benefit men. For many, this was a fight for survival, securing their rights, defending their property, and ensuring their children's future in a world where legal and social systems had not been designed with their well-being in mind. The broader social and economic impact of the Black Death also shifted the power dynamics between men and women, particularly in rural areas. With a reduced population and fewer available workers, wages for laborers, especially in agriculture, rose. This shift in the labor market meant that women, who had long been undervalued for their work in the home and fields, could demand higher wages for their labor. While this did not necessarily lead to full equality, it represented a dramatic change in the power dynamics of labor. Women had more leverage than they had ever had before to negotiate their roles within the economy. In the wake of the plague, some women, particularly those in towns and cities, began to gain more freedom to pursue work outside of the household. With so many men gone, women took on new roles in the marketplace, managing shops, crafting goods, and working in trades that had previously been reserved for men. Women became more visible in public life, particularly as many men had died or were incapacitated, leaving a gap in the workforce. Some women even stepped into roles traditionally held by men, such as tavern keepers, merchants, and skilled artisans. For the first time in history, the visibility of women in the public sphere increased, if only temporarily, as they adapted to the new social and economic realities of a post-plague world. This shift also had a lasting impact on marriage and family dynamics. With fewer men available for marriage, women found themselves with greater autonomy in choosing partners. In some areas, women were able to delay marriage or even choose not to marry at all. The significant loss of life among men meant that women had greater control over their marital decisions, and in some cases, women were able to negotiate better terms in marriage contracts. Although this was a temporary change, it reflected the shift in power dynamics that had been accelerated by the death toll of the plague. Religion, which had been a central part of medieval life, also played a crucial role in shaping women's responses to the aftermath of the plague. The Church's influence remained strong, but women's relationships with religion took on new dimensions in the wake of the Black Death. The plague had led many to question the Church's ability to protect them, and some women, particularly widows and the elderly, sought solace in spiritual practices outside the formal structure of the Church. Religious communities, especially convents, became refuges for women seeking shelter from the turbulence of the outside world. In these spaces, women found a sense of purpose and stability. And for some, the post-plague period offered an opportunity to engage more fully with religious life, taking up positions as abbesses or religious leaders within their communities. Though these shifts in women's roles were significant, they were not permanent. As Europe recovered from the Black Death, the social and economic systems slowly began to revert to their pre-plague state. The power that women had briefly held in the workforce and in their households was gradually undermined as the male population grew again. The feudal system, with its rigid gender roles and hierarchical structure, reasserted itself, and women were once again relegated to the domestic sphere. But the short-term changes that followed the Black Death were crucial moments of social transformation, showing that, in times of crisis, women could adapt and assert themselves in ways that were otherwise unimaginable. In retrospect, it becomes clear that the aftermath of the Black Death marked a critical turning point in the history of women's roles in society. Although much of the power gained by women was temporary, it demonstrated their ability to adapt, survive, and thrive in the face of unimaginable adversity. The fact that women were able to manage households, take on roles in the economy, and assert control over their own futures, even for a brief moment, stands as a testament to their resilience and strength. Yet, despite these changes, we must ask, what were the long-term consequences of the Black Death for women? Did the crisis and the subsequent shifts in social structures lead to a lasting change in the position of women, or did it merely represent a temporary disruption in the patriarchal order? As the waves of the Black Death began to recede and Europe slowly started its long recovery, the devastation left in its wake reshaped the landscape of society. The social, economic, and cultural consequences of the plague were felt for decades and even centuries, and in many ways, these changes offered women a glimpse of possibilities that had not existed before. However, the power gained by women during the crisis was fleeting, and as Europe recovered, the traditional gender roles began to reassert themselves. In the immediate aftermath of the plague, women had gained a greater degree of autonomy in both the domestic and public spheres. As discussed, widows were forced to take charge of their estates, and women in rural areas found new opportunities in the workforce as the shortage of laborers drove up wages. In towns and cities, women became more visible in the marketplace, engaging in trades and crafts that had previously been male-dominated. The very absence of so many men temporarily allowed women to step into roles of leadership and responsibility that had been unimaginable in the pre-plague world. However, as the population began to recover, so too did the deeply entrenched patriarchal structures that had defined medieval Europe for centuries. The resurgence of male labor, particularly as men returned from the war, death, or illness, saw many women relegated back to their traditional roles in the home. The political, social, and economic systems that had empowered men for centuries were not easily overturned, and even the temporary empowerment of women was undone as men reasserted their dominance in both the workforce and family life. While some widows and unmarried women maintained their newfound independence, the return of a larger male population meant that opportunities for women became scarce once again. Inheritance laws, which had allowed some women to control land and property in the absence of male heirs, were soon amended to favor male heirs once more. The labor market, which had temporarily rewarded women with higher wages, began to shift back as men resumed their roles in agriculture, trades, and guilds. For many women, the economic progress made during the aftermath of the Black Death was short-lived, as the feudal system returned to a more rigid structure. Despite these setbacks, the Black Death had a lasting impact on women's roles in society, particularly in the long-term cultural and social shifts it helped to accelerate. One of the most significant consequences of the plague was the changing role of women in religious life. As the Church's inability to protect the people during the pandemic became a subject of widespread criticism, many women found solace and agency in religious orders. Nuns and abbesses, some of whom had gained significant influence during the crisis, continue to play important roles in the spiritual and social lives of their communities. For many women, joining a convent became a way to escape the rigid confines of marriage and domestic life and to find a more independent path in a world still shaped by the Church. The Black Death also had a profound effect on women's economic roles. While the immediate gains made by women in the workforce were temporary, they had a lasting impact on the way society viewed women's labor. The role that women played in agriculture, trade, and domestic production during the post-plague period was not forgotten, even as the economic system gradually returned to its pre-plague state. This marked the beginning of a broader recognition of women's work as valuable and necessary. Over time, the idea that women could contribute meaningfully to the economy would be revisited during the early modern period, when women began to take on more prominent roles in the emerging market economies. The Black Death also forced Europe to reckon with its reliance on religious institutions to provide comfort and protection in times of crisis. While the Church's response to the plague had been largely inadequate, its role in women's lives remained pivotal. Women had always played an essential role in religious life, but the crisis deepened their connection to spiritual practices and religious leadership. For women who had lost everything to the plague, religious institutions became a safe haven, a place to seek solace, find purpose, and exert some measure of control over their futures. Yet, the Black Death's impact on women also reinforced a tragic irony. In times of crisis, society can offer opportunities for social change, but those changes are often short-lived. Women's temporary independence and visibility during the post-plague period showed that, in times of upheaval, gender roles could be fluid. But as Europe recovered, the return to stability also meant the reassertion of old norms. The ultimate consequence of the Black Death for women was a painful lesson in the fragility of hard-won gains in a society dominated by patriarchal structures. What then can we learn from this turbulent period in history? The Black Death showed the world the resilience of women, how they managed households, ran businesses, cared for the sick, and maintained their families. It also demonstrated that, in times of crisis, women could rise to the occasion and take on roles of power and influence. However, it also underscored the limits of women's power in a society that was unwilling to relinquish its deep-seated gender hierarchies. The lesson of the Black Death for women is not just one of survival, but of resistance, the ability to adapt, to find agency, and to push against the societal forces that sought to define them. In today's world, as we face global crises such as pandemics, economic upheavals, and political instability, we must reflect on the legacy of these women and how we can continue to build on their examples of resilience and resistance. The women of the Black Death may have lived in a time of unimaginable suffering, but their strength and adaptability remain as relevant today as they were then. So, as we reflect on this history, one must ask, in the face of future crises, how can we ensure that the hard-won rights and roles of women are not only preserved, but expanded? What lessons from the past can we apply to ensure that women's resilience in times of hardship leads to long-lasting societal change? Marriage in medieval Europe was rarely a matter of love, especially for noble women. For women of higher social standing, marriage was an instrument of power, wealth, and alliance rather than a personal choice. Noble women were often used as pawns in the complex game of dynastic politics. Their marriages arranged to secure land, form alliances, or strengthen a family's political position. For many of these women, the idea of personal choice in marriage was not even a consideration. They were bound by the same societal pressures that dictated the roles of women at all levels of society. But their marriages carried much greater stakes, not only for them, but for their families and entire regions. The notion of marital coverture, which was a fundamental legal principle, applied even more strongly to women of the nobility. Upon marriage, a woman's legal identity was subsumed by her husband. Although noble women might possess property and wealth before marriage, once they wed, these assets were controlled by their husbands. Women were expected to manage estates, produce heirs, and maintain the family's reputation, all while being largely dependent on their husbands' decisions. Though they were sometimes responsible for managing the household, overseeing servants, and making key decisions on day-to-day matters, they were still ultimately subject to the whims and authority of their husbands. From a young age, noble girls were groomed for marriage, their education tailored not to fulfill personal ambitions, but to prepare them for their duties as wives. These duties were clear. They were to secure their husband's legacy, bear children, especially sons, and ensure the family's wealth and power continued to thrive. The romantic ideal of marriage, which we may associate with today's world, had no place in the medieval aristocracy. The families of noble women, particularly in the higher echelons of society, viewed their daughters as valuable assets, pieces to be traded in a political transaction. Marriage contracts were often negotiated long before the bride reached adulthood, and many women had no say in whom they were to marry. They were expected to marry according to their parents' wishes, their personal preferences or desires irrelevant to the arrangement. These marriages were frequently solidified with a dowry, an agreed-upon sum or assets that the bride's family would provide to the groom in exchange for his taking her as his wife. For the noblewoman, the dowry was both an offering and a potential source of leverage within the marriage, though it was often controlled by her husband after the union. The constant expectation to produce heirs compounded the misery many noblewomen felt. A woman's worth was closely tied to her ability to bear children, especially sons, who could inherit the family's estate. For noble families, securing the next generation of heirs was not just a personal desire, but a matter of survival. For the lineage, the pressure to have children was immense, and any failure to produce an heir was seen as a serious failure, not just by the husband, but by the family and the broader social community. It is important to note that noble women had some leverage that lower-class women did not. While lower-class women had little to no control over whom they married, noble women could sometimes negotiate their marriages, or, in rare instances, choose to delay or refuse a marriage arrangement. Yet, even this limited agency was often circumvented by parental or political pressure. Families, particularly those with royal ambitions, would go to great lengths to ensure their daughters entered into advantageous marriages. These unions were often seen as opportunities for the family to gain land, titles, or military support, advantages that were far too important to allow for individual desires or preferences. In the case of royal or aristocratic marriages, where alliances between families or countries were at stake, these unions could have far-reaching consequences. A woman might be married to a man she had never met, who lived in a distant country for political reasons. These marriages were designed to strengthen or solidify alliances between ruling families, providing military or economic benefits. Such women, often leaving their homes and families to marry men they barely knew, lived with the constant uncertainty of being displaced and isolated from their familiar world. For many noble women, their marriages marked the beginning of a life of service, not to their husbands, but to the dynastic goals of their families. They were expected to bear children, manage estates, and often live in relative seclusion. They were often confined to the private spaces of the household, with limited access to the political or social spheres where power and influence were truly wielded. Their lives were shaped by the needs of their families, their personal desires or goals often left behind in the pursuit of the family's ambitions. But despite the rigid constraints of their marriages, some noble women found ways to carve out space for personal power. Through managing large estates, influencing political decisions behind the scenes, and engaging in charitable works, some noble women were able to wield considerable influence. Yet, even in these cases, their power was limited. They could act, but always within the confines of their husband's authority or the structures set by their families. Some noble women, particularly widows, were able to maintain control over their estates or even act as political leaders. But these exceptions only highlight how exceptional and rare such autonomy truly was. The dilemma that these women faced in medieval society is clear. Their lives were often defined by their marriages, not by their own choices. Their roles were constrained by laws and customs that tied their worth and freedom to their husbands. But even so, the fact that some were able to navigate this structure and exert influence within it demonstrates the resilience and adaptability of noble women. in an otherwise rigid and patriarchal society. The question remains, what impact did these marriages have on the personal lives of noblewomen? Did they ever manage to find fulfillment in a system that seemed more focused on dynastic survival than personal happiness? Could they ever truly be free, or were they forever bound to the interests of their families, their husbands, and the political structures that controlled their lives? While many noblewomen's lives were largely defined by the political purposes of their marriages, some women managed to subtly subvert the oppressive structures that constrained them. Though most noblewomen could not escape their role as dynastic tools, there were ways in which they exercised influence and power, even within the confines of a patriarchal system that was designed to keep them under control. One of the most significant strategies for exerting some control over their lives was through the management of their household and estates. While noblewomen may not have had direct authority over the political decisions of their husbands, they often wielded considerable power within the private spaces of their homes. Managing an estate, overseeing servants and tenants, and maintaining the financial health of a family's wealth were crucial tasks that were typically left to women while their husbands were away or preoccupied with other affairs. Even if this work was often unpaid and unrecognized by society, it was vital to the family's continued success. Widows, in particular, were able to leverage their position within the family structure to gain more independence. Upon the death of their husbands, many noblewomen were given control over the family's property and wealth, sometimes with legal rights to manage or even own the estate. These women were often able to become powerful political figures in their own right, managing land, overseeing legal matters, and sometimes acting as guardians for their children or other heirs. The death of a husband could result in a temporary shift in power dynamics, allowing women to assert themselves more boldly. However, this power was often short-lived, as families or male relatives usually moved quickly to remarry the widow to ensure that male authority was restored. Noblewomen's influence was not confined to the domestic sphere. Many of these women also had considerable sway in religious and social matters. The church, as a powerful institution in medieval life, offered opportunities for women to carve out space for themselves. Women like Hildegard of Bingen and Eleanor of Aquitaine were able to gain significant political and cultural influence, often using their roles as religious patrons or spiritual leaders to effect change in the broader society. Convents and abbeys, while religious spaces, often acted as centers of learning and power. For some noblewomen, joining a convent was a way to escape the rigid confines of marriage while still maintaining some form of influence, particularly through the control of wealth and property. But even in these rare cases, the subversion of the system was a double-edged sword. While some women managed to gain temporary autonomy, it often came at the cost of personal freedom. A woman's ability to exercise influence was limited by the prevailing social norms and the authority of male relatives, the church, and of course, the patriarchal structures that dominated medieval society. A widow might be able to manage an estate for a period, but as soon as a male heir came of age or a new husband was found, the power was swiftly returned to men. The tension between personal desires and dynastic obligations was particularly apparent for noble women who were forced to marry for political reasons. Women like Catherine of Aragon and Isabella of Castile were married to powerful men not out of love, but for the benefit of their families and countries. These marriages were often deeply unhappy, as they were defined not by mutual affection, but by the political needs of the time. Yet, these women were often expected to remain loyal to their husbands and continue bearing children to strengthen the family's position, despite the emotional cost. In some cases, women used their position in marriage to subtly influence the political landscape, advising their husbands or acting as intermediaries in diplomatic matters. However, these acts of influence were rarely celebrated or acknowledged by the broader society, and their power was often still overshadowed by their husband's authority. Another form of subversion was women's engagement with cultural and intellectual movements. Although women's education was generally limited, many noble women became patrons of the arts and were involved in the intellectual life of their time. These women helped shape the culture of the medieval courts by supporting artists, musicians, and writers. Through their patronage, noble women exercised an indirect form of power, helping to shape the culture and values of the court. Christine de Pizan, one of the most famous women writers of the time, used her literary works to critique the gender norms of the medieval period and to assert women's intellectual and moral agency. She became a celebrated author, using her pen to subtly challenge the conventional ideas of women's roles in society. However, the majority of noble women had no such means of subversion. Their lives were dictated by the strictures of marriage and the need to preserve family honor and legacy. In many cases, noble women were victims of political alliances that served the interests of their families, but not their own desires. These women often had little say in who they married, and even less in the manner in which they lived. While some might have been able to subtly influence their husbands or take on important roles within their households, they were still bound by the patriarchal system that defined medieval society. The notion of autonomy for a noble woman in this context was largely an illusion, as even the women who appeared to exercise power often did so within a system that was structured to limit their freedom. This raises an important question. In the midst of all these constraints and limitations, how did these women find ways to assert themselves? Was it through their influence on the private affairs of their households, through their roles in religion, or through the subtle subversions of marriage? What did it mean for a woman in this society to have power, and what did it cost them? While the marriages of noble women were often formed with the primary goal of securing alliances, wealth, and political power, they left a long-lasting impact on the legal and social frameworks that would shape the future of women's rights. The constraints of these marriages were not just felt by the women who lived through them. Their legacy continued to reverberate through centuries, influencing both the development of family law and the broader role of women in European society. In the medieval period, a noblewoman's role was defined by her marriage and her ability to bear heirs. While this was largely true for women of all social classes, the political nature of noble marriages added an additional layer of complexity and constraint. These unions were not personal, but political, and the consequences of marriage extended far beyond the individuals involved. For centuries, marriage was seen as a tool of political and familial strategy, and a noblewoman's personal happiness or desires rarely factored into this equation. One of the most significant legacies of medieval noblewomen's marriages is the way these alliances influenced the development of laws regarding inheritance, property, and family structure. Because marriage was often about securing land and wealth, the control of property in marriage became a central issue. In many cases, women were left with little control over their own wealth and property once married. This was particularly true in the case of coverture, a principle in which a wife's legal identity was absorbed by her husband. Although some noble women had the potential to inherit property, they were often unable to control it fully, as it was transferred into their husband's hands upon marriage. Over time, these restrictions began to shift. The practice of jointure, where women could hold property in their own right for life after their husband's death, began to evolve as an attempt to protect women's financial security. This shift was not born out of a desire to grant women more power, but out of practical concerns about the role women played in preserving family wealth and managing estates. As the responsibilities of estate management increasingly fell to women, even if only during periods of widowhood, the legal structures that once restricted women began to be modified. This gradual loosening of property laws for women, though often rooted in pragmatic concerns, set the stage for future reforms that would eventually lead to women's expanded rights in the property domain. While noble women's ability to manage property was limited during their marriages, their influence over religious and charitable endeavors grew in importance. Many noble women, even within the confines of their marriages, had a unique opportunity to affect social change. By sponsoring monasteries, funding charitable works, or supporting the arts, these women were able to shape culture and society in ways that men could not always directly control. Through religious patronage, noble women exerted influence not only within their own households, but also in the broader societal context, and their legacy in this respect cannot be overstated. Furthermore, some noble women were able to secure legal autonomy through their role as widows. In the absence of a male heir, widows were sometimes allowed to manage the family estate and make decisions that were traditionally reserved for men. Although this autonomy was often short-lived, it had a profound effect on women's role in the economic life of medieval Europe. Widows who successfully managed estates were not only able to preserve their family's wealth, but also often gained a measure of respect and power within their communities. This period of relative autonomy marked a brief but significant moment in the broader trajectory of women's rights, even though it was typically limited to women who were wealthier and of higher social status. While women in medieval marriages were often denied personal agency, there were instances in which noble women used their marriages to further their own ambitions, or at least to secure some form of personal influence. The marriage of Eleanor of Aquitaine to Henry II of England is one of the most famous examples. Although Eleanor was initially married to Louis VII of France, her marriage to Henry II gave her unprecedented political influence and control over a vast portion of Western Europe. As Queen of both France and England, Eleanor's political power was not just theoretical. She played a key role in the governance of her lands, and her influence was instrumental in shaping the political landscape of the 12th century. However, even this remarkable level of influence came with a price. Eleanor's marriage to Henry was tumultuous, and her role in politics was often complicated by her subordination within the marriage. This conflict between personal power and societal expectation was central to the experiences of most noble women. While their marriages allowed for moments of autonomy and influence, they were constantly undermined by the legal and social structures that defined their roles as wives and mothers. The tension between these competing forces was a defining feature of noble women's lives, and their ability to navigate this tension offers key insights into the struggles for gender equality that would unfold in later centuries. In the long term, the marriages of medieval noblewomen contributed to the shaping of European legal systems, particularly in relation to inheritance and property laws. Although women's full legal autonomy was not realized until centuries later, The gradual changes that began during the medieval period laid the foundation for the legal advancements that would follow. By asserting their roles as managers of estates, patrons of the arts, and influential figures within religious institutions, medieval noblewomen carved out spaces for themselves within a society that largely sought to limit their power. So, what is the legacy of these women's marriages? While their lives were often constrained by their roles as wives and mothers, their influence shaped the very foundations of European society, from economic systems to cultural norms. The evolution of inheritance laws, the role of women in religious life, and the gradual shift in property rights all reflect the subtle yet significant impact that these women had on their world. Yet, despite these contributions, the question remains: did these women ever truly have the freedom to live according to their own desires? Or were they forever bound by the expectations of their families and societies? In medieval Europe, the majority of women's labor was conducted in the private sphere, within the home. This was true for women across all social classes, from peasant families to the noble households. Yet, despite its significance, the work of women in the household was often undervalued and overlooked by contemporary chroniclers, historians, and society itself. It is only in modern times that we are beginning to recognize just how crucial women's domestic labor was to the survival and functioning of medieval society. For women of the lower classes, the home was both a workplace and a place of refuge. Peasant women were often responsible for nearly every aspect of daily life in the household: cooking, cleaning, childcare, textile production, food preservation, and agricultural work. In addition to this, they often worked the fields alongside their husbands, performing tasks such as planting, harvesting, and caring for livestock. This combination of tasks, from the house to the field, made women indispensable to the survival of the family and the community. In medieval times, domestic work was a constant and exhausting endeavor. Without the modern conveniences of electricity, running water, or efficient cooking methods, daily chores took up the bulk of a woman's time. Women were expected to ensure that their homes were functional and clean, prepare food, and care for children and the elderly. Cooking was an all-day affair, involving the preparation of large meals, sometimes for extended family members or guests. There were no refrigerators or preserved foods, so women had to be creative in finding ways to store food, which often meant drying, salting, or smoking meats and vegetables, as well as making cheese or preserves. In addition to these domestic tasks, women were also responsible for the care and management of textiles. Spinning wool or flax into thread, weaving cloth, and making clothes were vital tasks in a society where ready-made garments were rare and expensive. The process of making clothing for the family could take months, and women worked tirelessly to ensure that their households had adequate clothing for the coming seasons. For noble women, textile production was often managed on a larger scale, with weaving, embroidery, and sewing being part of the formal duties that accompanied their roles within the household. Another critical aspect of women's labor in the medieval home was childcare. While men typically worked outside the home or on the farm, it was women who managed the children, educating them in basic skills and household tasks. The care of young children, along with the responsibility of educating them, was primarily a woman's job. She would also be responsible for the health of the family, nursing babies, tending to illnesses, and utilizing herbal remedies passed down from generations. Women in the household also took on the role of midwife, assisting with childbirth and offering advice on family planning, despite the dangers of childbirth and the limitations of medical knowledge. While domestic duties kept women busy at home, those living in urban settings often faced additional challenges. In cities and towns, women could participate in trade and commerce, but their roles were still primarily centered around the home. Women in these areas were frequently involved in the production of goods for sale, including textiles, bread, ale, and candles. They were also responsible for managing small businesses, especially in the absence of their husbands. Women could work in bakeries, inns, or even workshops producing various goods, but their labor was seldom recognized outside the immediate family or community. For noble women, the work at home took on a more institutionalized form. While noble women were often involved in managing large estates, overseeing the work of servants, and organizing household activities, the most important role they played was that of the manager of domestic life. Many noble women took on the responsibility of overseeing the household staff, making sure that the various tasks of cooking, cleaning, and maintaining the estate were carried out efficiently. In addition, noble women were also responsible for running household finances, often managing large sums of money in order to ensure that their households and lands were economically stable. Despite these significant responsibilities, women's labor in the medieval home was often undervalued and invisible. In much of the historical record, domestic work is rarely mentioned, and when it is often described in terms of woman's duty rather than an essential, hard labor. There is little recognition in contemporary documents of just how much work was required to keep a household running, or the physical and emotional toll it took on women. Medieval chronicles and legal documents often focus on men's public roles, battle, politics, and law, but the labor of women, carried out largely behind closed doors, was taken for granted. Even in the case of noble women, who might manage estates and participate in politics, their domestic work is rarely acknowledged as a source of power or influence. Yet, the importance of this labor cannot be overstated. The efficiency and success of a medieval household relied on the contributions of women. They were the ones who kept the home running, who produced the food, clothing, and textiles that sustained the family, and who managed the finances and health of the household. Their work provided the foundation upon which the rest of society stood. The question that arises from this is, how can we begin to recognize and value the work of women in medieval households? What are the broader implications of acknowledging the significance of their labor in shaping medieval society? In the medieval period, the role of women in the household was not just one of necessity, but also of economic value. While their work was often confined to domestic spaces, it had far-reaching implications for the broader medieval economy. Women's labor was essential in maintaining the productivity of both peasant and noble households, yet their contributions were often overshadowed by the more visible work of men in fields, politics, and warfare. Despite the overwhelming demand for women's labor in the home, social mobility for women was limited. Women's roles were generally defined by their relationship to the men in their lives, first their fathers, then their husbands. For peasant women, marriage was often the only option for social advancement, as the marriage contract brought, with it, some measure of land or wealth. While men could inherit land and titles, women were frequently excluded from these privileges, meaning their economic standing largely depended on the success of their husbands or male relatives. However, women did have opportunities to exert influence in certain sectors of the medieval economy. For example, Women in urban areas sometimes worked as merchants, craftswomen, and traders. While men dominated these industries, women found ways to participate. Many worked alongside their husbands in shops or workshops, while others managed businesses independently, particularly if they were widowed. Women in these situations gained a degree of economic power that was otherwise difficult to come by. In some cities, such as London or Paris, women were able to work in guilds, though their roles were often restricted to specific trades, like textile production or food-related industries. The urban environment, with its more fluid social and economic structures, allowed women more autonomy in some ways than the rural world. In the country, a woman's labor was primarily tied to the land, and her economic power was virtually non-existent outside of the household. However, in towns and cities, the presence of a marketplace and the rise of trade allowed women to carve out space for themselves in the commercial world. For example, women in the medieval textile trade, such as spinners or weavers, held valuable skills that made them essential to the local economy. Women were also involved in brewing, baking, and selling food, where they could participate in the highly lucrative food production and sale processes. Despite the opportunities that urban environments provided, women still faced significant barriers to achieving full independence. Social structures, gender roles, and legal restrictions made it difficult for women to engage in business or commerce in the same way that men did. For instance, many guilds barred women from joining, though exceptions existed. Even when women were allowed to participate, their influence was often limited by the presence of male relatives who managed the family's business or estate. A woman could run a bakery, but her husband, father, or brother often controlled the family wealth and made important decisions about the business. In noble households, women's economic contributions were often hidden behind the public power that their husbands wielded. However, noble women played an essential role in managing estates, particularly when their husbands were away for war or political matters. Women were responsible for overseeing the production of goods, managing household finances, and organizing the agricultural labor that sustained the estate. Though women in these positions were not considered landowners by law, they had the power to manage the resources that were essential to the family's economic survival. One notable example of noblemen exerting economic control was through the dowry system. The dowry was a significant portion of a woman's inheritance, and it was often used to solidify political or familial alliances. In some cases, noble women were able to retain control over their dowries, especially in the event of widowhood. These women could then use their wealth to maintain a measure of independence and autonomy. While the dowry system placed women in a subordinate position, it also provided them with resources that could help them secure their position in a world dominated by male authority. In the religious sphere, women's work was also indispensable. While the church's male-dominated structure limited women's public roles, women nonetheless made valuable contributions to religious life. Women in religious orders, nuns, abbesses, and other religious figures, often managed substantial landholdings and were responsible for the economic prosperity of their convents. These women had authority over large estates, engaging in agricultural, production, trade, and charitable work. Nuns often had control over land that was rented out to farmers or leased to merchants, and they used this wealth to support the religious community, provide for the poor, and fund religious institutions. The economic work of medieval women, both in the household and in the broader economy, laid the foundation for the social and economic changes that would occur over the centuries. While many of the roles women held in the medieval period were Informal and unrecognized, they were nonetheless essential to the survival of families, communities, and the broader economy. Yet, the limitations placed on women's access to formal economic and political power ensured that their work would go largely unacknowledged for generations. Despite these constraints, the value of women's labor in medieval households had lasting effects. Over time, the contributions of women in the economy would lead to shifts in social and economic structures. As women increasingly became involved in trade, commerce, and agriculture, their presence in the public sphere grew. In later centuries, as Europe moved into the Renaissance and beyond, the role of women in commerce, education, and politics would expand further, though not without continued struggles for equal rights. So, what lessons can we take from the overlooked labor of medieval women? How can we acknowledge the invisible work that sustained medieval society? And how can this understanding shape our view of the contributions women make in today's world? The medieval period, with its rigid gender roles and hierarchical social structure, left a legacy that continues to shape our understanding of women's work today. Though the labor of women in medieval households was largely invisible and undervalued, it was foundational to the survival and success of both families and communities. In many ways, the contributions of women in the home laid the groundwork for the development of modern economies, and their work deserves to be recognized for the crucial role it played in sustaining medieval society. While historians have often focused on the more visible labor of men, such as farming, warfare, and political affairs, the work of women was essential in maintaining the stability of the household. Women were responsible for the day-to-day tasks that kept the family alive and functioning: food preparation, childcare, textile production, and domestic care. These tasks may have been seen as women's work and relegated to the private sphere, but they were anything but trivial. Without women's labor, households would have struggled to survive, and the broader economy would have faltered. The importance of women's labor extended beyond the walls of their homes. The skills that women developed in textile production, baking, brewing, and farming were central to local economies. Women's involvement in agriculture, particularly in peasant families, ensured that the food supply was maintained and that goods were produced for local trade. In towns and cities, women worked as shopkeepers, traders, and craftswomen, participating in the growing marketplace. Though often excluded from formal guilds and institutions, women's work was integral to the functioning of medieval commerce and trade. One of the most significant legacies of women's domestic work is the way it shaped the division of labor and the social expectations of gender roles. While medieval women were expected to focus on domestic tasks, their contributions were not just limited to household maintenance. Many women played vital roles in the local economy, whether through managing family businesses, working as artisans, or selling goods. In rural areas, women's knowledge of the land and their ability to care for livestock made them indispensable to the agricultural process. Women were responsible for ensuring that the harvest was gathered, the animals were cared for, and the family's basic needs were met. This domestic labor, while often undervalued, was central to the survival of the household and the community. However, as the centuries progressed and the world moved toward early modernity, the visibility of women's work in the public sphere began to shift. The increasing rise of the market economy and the development of more formal institutions slowly reduced the importance of domestic work in sustaining the larger economy. The roles that women had once held within the home, managing estates, working in crafts and producing goods for trade, were gradually replaced by male-dominated industries and institutions. As men took over the management of land, trade, and commerce, women were increasingly pushed into the private sphere, and their work became relegated to the domestic domain. Despite these shifts, the economic contributions of medieval women continued to resonate in the centuries that followed. Women's involvement in production, trade, and household management laid the foundation for later social movements, particularly during the Industrial Revolution, when women once again entered the workforce in greater numbers. The patterns of labor that were established in the medieval period would evolve into the modern concepts of women's work, both in the home and in the broader economy. The legacy of medieval women's domestic labor also extends into modern ideas about women's roles in society. While much has changed over the centuries, the essential work that women performed in medieval households remains a touchstone for discussions about gender, labor, and the value of domestic work. The domestic sphere, once seen as the exclusive domain of women, has evolved into a site of struggle for equality, with women today still fighting for recognition and fair compensation for their labor in the home. So, as we reflect on the overlooked labor of medieval women, we must ask, how can we better understand and value the contributions of women today, both in the home and in the broader economy? How do we ensure that the invisible labor that women continue to perform is recognized for the vital role it plays in sustaining families, communities, and nations? The medieval period shows us that the labor of women is not a private matter, confined only to domestic spaces, but a cornerstone of society. By recognizing this, we can begin to appreciate the full extent of women's contributions to history and ensure that their work is never overlooked again.